Hello, everyone. Welcome to our forum. I am so excited to have each of you here today sharing your time with us via Zoom. This forum is Blinded by Bias, rooting out the bias in your organization. I'm really happy to bring to you Stephen Francis this morning. He has a long history in diversity and inclusion and in law. He's spent 35 years in this space. 13 at Honda, but you may know him as the Chief Diversity Officer with Mayor Ginther. He's coming here to discuss a number of items that I think you'll be able to really take back to your organizations. They'll be tangible and actionable. You'll see his slides today as they are chocked full of really great information, and you'll be able to take those slides back with you today. A few bits of housekeeping. The first is that this session is being recorded. I want you to know that. The recording will also be made available to you after this presentation, so keep your eyes peeled for that. If you haven't already registered for this on Eventbrite, please go ahead and do so. That will allow us to have your email address, and we'll be able to send you the slides for this. And also, we have a post-forum survey. We really want to hear your feedback about what you thought about this, what you thought we could do better. And also there's a segment on what other types of forums you would like to have brought to you. So please, please do register so we can get that to you. Also Q&A. We will not be monitoring the chat box really. So if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box instead of the chat box. I'll be monitoring those. Throughout the presentation, we will be able to give Steve a few questions here and there, but there is a Q&A portion designated for the last 15 minutes of this event where we'll really get to dig into the meat of many of your questions. Do note that you can upvote any of the questions there. So if somebody asked a question that you want to know the answer to, please upvote those questions, and that'll help us know that you are interested in that specific topic. Without any further ado, I bring you Stephen Francis.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And I'm happy to be here to present to all of you today. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what we'll be covering. A third of this workshop will be focused on providing an overview of a baseline overview of implicit bias in both individual and systemic forms. The second portion will be focused on how these biases can disrupt or adversely impact the hiring process of organizations and individuals. And lastly, we'll explore in some detail organizational and systemic biases and give you some pointers on how you might be able to better address those as they pop up within your organizations. So let's get right to it. Understanding implicit bias, the first step in the 12-step program, if you will, is understanding that everyone has implicit biases. Admitting that everyone has these is the start off point. And next bullet, we will talk about what we see on social media, the music we listen to, our conversations at the dinner table, although we don't eat much at the dinner table anymore, our conversations in break rooms at work, where we go to church, where we go to school, what side of the town or railroad tracks or river that we were raised on or live on, who our friends are, etc., all help to shape and form all of our implicit biases. Next. Implicit biases develop from a human need to process an abundance of information quickly. And we'll talk more about this. It's something called schemas. And the salient point here is we receive 11 million bits of information every moment. Our mind and brain is very powerful, right? But our brain can only consciously process 40 bits of information each moment. So we've got information overload, and our brain is trying to make this as easy on it as possible. And we slip to some assumptions and stereotypes in the process. Next. To process that information more efficiently, the brain uses shortcuts, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, these shortcuts often lead to harmful stereotypes when applied to people and circumstances that we deal with every day. Next. Important point here, implicit biases don't make us good people or bad people. The word bias tends to have a negative context to it. It's a natural part of our body and the way we work, our brain works, and the barrage of information that we are bombarded with every day. However, how we act upon or fail to act upon these biases, what we do or don't do because of them, can lead to disparate treatment, harm, injury, and yes, as we've seen rampantly on the news lately, even death to others as we react to situations based on perceived biases and stereotypes. And lastly, on this slide, allowing implicit bias and negative stereotypes to run rampant in organizations like yours is harmful and very likely to reduce the diversity and inclusion within the workforce. Next slide. If you have a brain, you have bias. And the salient point here is right under the title of this slide. Our brain constantly seeks what it recognizes as comfort, safety, and the path of least resistance. You see these boxes that surround the red box of unconscious bias, things that trigger our implicit biases or our schemas is time constraints. We all have that at work. Uncertainty, fear, stress. We all have that every day. Fatigue. All these are triggers that activate our brain's striving and craving for comfort, safety, and the path of least resistance. Non-conscious expectations or biases associated with members of a group that guide perceptions and behaviors. Action based on schemas is pervasive and inevitable. Like I said, everybody has biases. However, schemas can be distorting and result in poor judgment. Before we move to the next slide, I want to read for you an example of schemas. And I'll be right back with you. I'm just going to get rid of my video so I can read to you an example of schemas. Schemas can lead to prejudice. Some of our schemas will be stereotypes, generalized ideas about whole groups of people. Whenever we encounter an individual from a certain group that we have a stereotype about, we will expect their behavior to fit into our schema. This can cause us to misinterpret the actions and intentions of others. And here's an example. We may believe anyone who is elderly is mentally compromised. If we meet an older individual who is sharp and perceptive and engaged in an intellectually stimulating conversation with us, that would challenge our stereotype of them being mentally compromised. We might simply believe the individual was having a good day, or we might recall the one time during that conversation that the individual seemed to have trouble remembering a fact and forget about all the sharpness and stimulating conversation that we had with the person to justify our schema or our stereotype of those people we consider elderly or mentally compromised. Hope that makes sense. Let's go to the next slide. I don't know why I'm not getting the views up here, but hopefully you can. Let's go into the types of implicit biases. Implicit bias unconsciously and involuntarily allows our attitudes, feelings, stereotypes, or beliefs to impact our judgment or understanding of people, things, circumstances, situations, or actions. And they can be based on all those categories: race, sexual orientation, height, etc., affinity groups, colleges that you attend. So I want to go through some examples of types of implicit bias. Affinity bias, a bias tending to be more receptive to people who resemble our lives in some way or remind us of ourselves. That can be our race, our gender, our age, where we came from, Midwest, South, Southern, etc. Confirmation bias. This is actually an example of schemas, where our mind searches for information to support a belief, view, or position, and ignores details and even facts and clear evidence to the contrary, just like the example of the elderly person I just sent you through. Halo effect bias. That's when we admire something about a certain person and assume that everything about that person is better, great, or wonderful, or without fault. This is associated with celebrities that we see on TV. You know, they are imperfect people, but we put them on a pedestal just because they're in the celebrity limelight. Perception bias, based on what or who they belong to or associate with. You know, those people that listen to that rap music, or those folks that listen to country music, we put them in certain boxes based on stereotypes that we believe to be true. In-group bias, that's to provide advantages to members of the groups we identify with. An example of this is sororities or fraternities that we belong to. They can do no wrong, right? They're the greatest people on earth. They're our brothers, our sisters. Bandwagon bias, a familiar group or association of people believe that something by default or on principle, simply because others believe in that group or association. I'll give you an example of this that applies directly to me. I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, and they can do no wrong, although they can win no games, right? But anyway, you get the point. Those are just an overview of the types of biases that we encounter. Next slide. I'd like to give you sort of a high-level view of how implicit bias can interrupt or disrupt or undermine, as this slide indicates, the hiring process. And you have 13 biases, and I won't go over all of them. I would, you know, encourage you to review all of these because they're all instructive. But I'll focus on first impression bias. First impressions are lasting, right? So there might be something that we see right off the bat that we can't get out of our mind as we're interviewing that person. It's front of mind, whether it's the braided, how their hair is braided, or something of that nature. Nonverbal behaviors. This one is that soft handshake or that firm handshake. That tends to categorize them as either weak or strong, good or bad candidate, right? Stereotype bias. If someone has a tattoo on their body that's noticeable, you would categorize them automatically or stereotype them in a certain bucket that may be negative. Heightism bias. I'm 6'3", and many other tall people are given credit for being smart, leaders, all that kind of thing, when it could be nothing further than from the truth. They could be the total opposite of that, but just because of their height, we give them extra benefit of the doubt. Confirmation bias. And this is the schemas in real time. Tendency to seek out information that supports our biases or stereotypes and ignore evidence and facts that disprove it. And lastly, anti-immigrant bias down in the lower hand corner there to the left. This can be done immediately when someone has an accent that tends to be different from what we would consider normal accent. We automatically pigeonhole them into an immigrant category. Let's pause for a minute so that we can get some technology to get my picture back up. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So the next slide. Okay, uh, implicit bias in the hiring process uh, also, kind of defaults when we look for fit. And you've heard this expression, I'm sure, within your organizations. He or she is not a good fit, or he or she is a good fit. So in this first paragraph, this is all from the Harvard Business Review from February 2018, an article called Beware the Fit, How to Hire. When seeking to hire or find the right people, and I emphasize right people, who determines whether they're right or wrong based on the interview. However, um, the right people to join our organization, we encourage you not to search for culture fit, but instead search for culture add. What most people really mean when they say that someone is a good fit is that he or she is someone we can get along with and that they think will conform to the organization or fit in uh, our culture, norms, etc. People with diverse backgrounds in the next paragraph experiences and personalities that don't exist in your organization. And that's a key point here, and we'll discuss this further later. People with diverse backgrounds, experiences, and personalities that don't exist in your organization can also be great at the job you need to have done. This misguided good fit hiring strategy can also contribute to a company's lack of diversity, since often people we enjoy hanging out with have backgrounds, college backgrounds, etc., much like our own. And I'd like to explore this in a little bit more detail. In diversity and inclusion, we say that diversity is whatever is lacking within your organization. Whatever is lacking or not present within your organization is diversity. And this gets us off of that stereotypical or default view that diversity means Black and brown people only, right? So here's an example. In the nursing profession, generally speaking, diversity tends to be women. I'm sorry, diversity tends to be men because nursing profession is pretty much female dominated. So diversity there would be men, whether they're white, Black, purple. In the construction industry, generally speaking, a diversity in the construction trades would generally mean a lack of women, right? So there's an example where men and women represent diversity based on the different occupations that you're seeking to hire for. Finally, I used to be Chief Diversity Officer for the City of Columbus, and the Health Commissioner, Dr. Teresa Long, said, Steve, we have a very diverse department because our high-risk populations for health disease and illness tend to be in diverse populations, whether that be ethnic diversity or gender diversity. What we need, Steve, is more white guys, right? So diversity for the Columbus Department of Health was hiring more white men to demonstrate the instances of health disparities that goes on in that community. So that's just a prime example of how diversity can be whatever you're lacking. Don't stereotype the label of diversity to fit your stereotypical view of what diversity should be within your organization. Next slide. We're going to talk about implicit bias versus systemic bias. And it's very simple. Systemic bias is prejudice, bigotry, unfairness directed by health, educational, government, judicial, legal, religious, political, financial, media, and cultural institutions. But again, it's institutional and expands through all those different types of areas of our society. Next bullet tells us that implicit bias or unconscious bias are those same prejudice, bigotries, etc., from a privileged group towards individuals from an oppressed or marginalized group. And the last bullet, the bottom line is systemic biases are barriers maintained by institutions, while unconscious biases are ones upheld by individuals. Next slide. Now, what is this thing called systemic bias? Well, we believe that it's less about violence or burning crosses than it is about everyday decisions made by people who may not even think of themselves as biased or racist. Again, remember, everybody has biases. So that's a false, a non-starter that folks may not think they're biased. The goal of this workshop is to help you better identify those biases and manage them before they do adversely impact your decision-making process. Next bullet, a sociologist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, said, the main problem nowadays is that the folks with the hoods, is not the folks with the hoods rather, but the folks dressed in suits. And I think we may have a question.
Yes, so we have a question from the audience. The question is, how do we assess for what diversity we are lacking or what we need? Do you have an organization assessment or practice that you believe works well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every organization should have a demographic snapshot of how they look demographically across levels of the organization, across job classes. However, industry-wide, there is demographic data based on industries that tell you how you, when you cross overlay your snapshot of your demographics over the industry demographic trends, it will tell you if you're out of bounds or inbounds or off target or on target. The other thing that I've done for clients is done, these organizational assessments and D&I appraisals that tend to peel back the onion of processes and systems. In some cases, clients have had to develop parallel systems to empower and give opportunities to those that have been traditionally left out because they couldn't, for some reason or another, access other systems for, let's say, professional development or advancement and promotion or future leadership within the company or organization. So sometimes you have to create parallel systems to fight that systemic bias, and you have to be honest and open. Here's how one person put it to me, and it was very profound. This was a police chief of a municipality I was representing. And he said, I have to challenge my police procedures and processes daily. It's important that the police department bases practices and policies on best practices, not past practices. And by that he meant past practices, just because we've always done it that way, is not a good answer as to why you have a policy or procedure. And it might be out of step with the current situations and climates and circumstances that are going on today. So the idea is to be nimble and flexible enough to keep track of best practices and not default to past practices, which may get you into trouble and be based on systemic biases or stereotypes. Hope that answers the question. And the next bullet, systemic bias persists in our schools, offices, court systems, etc. Next bullet. When one group of people occupy most positions of decision-making power, the other people have a difficult time getting a fair shake, let alone getting ahead. You noticed it said one group of people. It doesn't say white people or black people, because this applies to any dominant group of people that would tend to exclude or not give a fair shake to another group of people, whether they're white, black, blue, purple, Hispanic, LGBTQ, etc. So beware of these biases across cultural, ethnic, and gender lines. Next slide. Systemic bias. This is a diagram, sort of a continuum diagram that I thought would be helpful and instructive. And it starts from that history, policies, and practices part of the diagram where you see the handcuffs and the preamble or the Constitution. those are historic things that are in place that establish, our view of the world and view of people within the world. For example, you can relate that scribe to the Three-Fifths Compromise within the Constitution and the Federalist 54th paper, right? That cemented the fact that slaves were to be counted as 3/5 of a person, right? And that determined how members of legislature were appointed and how many members of Congress were appointed to each district. So the southern areas got more legislators than the northern districts at that time. And then you go down the continuum and you see how these types of institutional and historic policies and practices have disproportionately impacted the quality of education and the criminal justice system. Inequities, outcomes, and racial disparities are embedded within our society. And then you go on up the circle, and we prime these associations and assumptions in everyday media, social media, newspaper. So it gets reinforced day after day, minute by minute, into our schema that reinforces some of the stereotypes. And I'd like to read a little bit to expound upon this diagram. And I'll just keep myself up. You'll just have to see me reading. I apologize. But this will give you a good example of what this diagram is trying to display. Okay. When we look at that upper right-hand corner, the handcuffs, etc., policies and practices that consolidate and protect power bestow unearned economic, social, cultural, and political advantage to people called white, and unearned disadvantage to people of color. And that's a way to describe white privilege in a nutshell, right? Going down to the next part of the diagram, it talks about the fact that inequitable outcomes and experiences resulting from policy decisions in health, housing, employment, education, and life expectancy reinforces white supremacist beliefs and ideology. Dominant narrative uses disparate outcomes as evidence of white supremacy, promotes whiteness as normal and desirable, and justifies inequality. And this is what I call, it reinforces that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We created the prophecy through the handcuffs and the Constitution history, and we fulfill that prophecy by having more Black folks in jail, thus justifying our stereotype that they're more criminal, or decreasing the quality of education in the inner city, which reduces the ability for folks to learn and earn a fair living like others do. And then the last part of this diagram, the upswing, dominant narratives about race, family, media, society, coupled with rationalized structural arrangements and differential outcomes by race, all prime us to believe that people of color are inferior to white people, create and maintain harmful associations, and leads us to make harmful assumptions. So again, that's that reinforcing of that stereotype by the media influences that we see daily and that we are barraged with daily. Next slide. John Powell, who was the former executive director of the OSU Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, a very, very prominent and nationally known and internationally known think tank that is had expert white papers on implicit bias. He talks about the fact that biases not only affect our perceptions, but our policies and institutional arrangements. Therefore, these biases influence the type of outcomes we see across a variety of contexts, school, labor, etc. So you can see how these things sort of fulfill the prophecy. Next slide. We're going to talk about how systemic bias affects various aspects of our society. And we'll start with wealth. And this information is from a Pew Institute study. The folks who control all the wealth, as you can see from this diagram, are predominantly white, where they comprise 77% of the population, yet 90% of the wealth. And that's where you hear that 1% of the folks own 90 some odd percent of the wealth. And by wealth, we mean something that tends to appreciate in value that you own, right? Not a car, which people associate with flashy wealth, these flashy symbols, but real estate, stock and all these other investments. And you see the African-American proportionate wealth vis-a-vis their proportion of the population. Let's go to the next category. Employment. This is from a study by the Atlantic publication. African Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed. Let's go to the next box of education. This is from the US Department of Education study. Black students are 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended or disciplined for the same infractions, right? Next slide. Healthcare. This is a study done by a thinkprogress.org think tank organization, but it found that 67% of doctors have a bias against African American patients. This is also known as medical apartheid, and this rears its head particularly in cancer treatment. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, Steve, my 90-year-old father who is struggling with cancer, they will not give him morphine because of these rules related to opioids, where I know of white friends of mine whose parents are going through the same thing, and they are liberally giving them morphine for their comfort. Somehow this idea that Black folks can withstand more pain than others, probably due to their stereotypes related to slavery and other things. Next box is surveillance. This is a US Department of Justice study that found that Black drivers are 30% more likely to be pulled over than other ethnic drivers of other ethnicities. Next box, criminal justice. Blacks make up 13% of the general population, yet 40% of the prison population. And I don't know how many of you have read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, where she talks about the prison industrial complex and how the drug wars of the 80s, et cetera, had disproportionately set Black folks into the criminal justice system at disproportionate rates. And we know what the felony tag has for the ability for folks to have meaningful and gainful employment and to even have the right to vote once they get out of jail. Housing. This is a US Department of HUD study. Blacks are shown 18% fewer homes to buy and 4% fewer rental units than whites. We all know some of us may know the history of redlining, where years ago, banks were drawing red lines around less desirable areas to lend money for folks to buy homes and property. And this was a direct result of systemic racism in housing lending. So those with GI Bills who had the ability to pay were still relegated to certain areas of the community because of these redlining requirements that banks imposed upon lending. Systemic racism. Next slide, we'll kind of end with these 2 slides. Any kind of bias can cause organizations to miss opportunities because people will make decisions that are not objective, maintain practices that are not expedient or foster a distrustful culture that will not lead to a competitive advantage. And we all organizations represented on this webinar, I'm sure, would love to have competitive advantage. And so here's how you can eliminate and or reduce different types of biases within your organizations. And I wanted to give you these practical tools to take with you. First bullet, ensure transparency. And by that, we mean examine decision-making, social networking, policies, and procedures to determine where bias might exist. And this might relate to the question that someone asked earlier about how you can define what's lacking in your organization and why it's lacking in your organization. Pull back the hood, peel back the onion, and examine yourself through some assessments and self-evaluations. Second bullet, seek multi-dimensional feedback. Don't just ask one Black person or one gay person or one woman whether bias exists. You know, those folks aren't monolithic, what they call monolithic. You can't single out one Black person and think that that person speaks for, thinks for, and represents all Black people. Same with Hispanic, same with Asian. There's diversity within diversity. And so don't put people in monolithic boxes. Build trust, the third bullet. By that, I want to focus on the last sentence. But consistently making small changes over time is more effective than sweeping changes, right? Leading by example is a powerful tool for building trust. We all know that you can build trust over 2 decades, and one word, one act can destroy 2 decades of trust that you've built. And so modeling the behavior, I tell my clients all the time, if you want, the best way to change culture in your organization is through modeling the behavior that you want to exist in your organization. And that ever so slowly turns the cruise ship in that other direction. As the bullet says, don't make sweeping changes, make small changes that over time will turn that cruise ship in a different direction. And we call this modeling behavior. And leaders, this is incumbent upon you to walk the walk and talk the talk, because people are looking at you to determine whether you're practicing what you preach. Next bullet, next slide rather. You need to create opportunities to build relationships across differences. And to expound upon this, there's these in-group or out-of-group, or the insiders versus the outsiders. And I have a whole workshop exercise on insider behavior and outsider behavior. You could have that temporary employees versus full-time employees, one department versus another, you know, them versus us, or the others, right? Those people. So create opportunities to build relationships across differences. And further down in that bullet, form dynamic work groups comprised of different people, managers and employees, field office staff and headquarters staff. You know, mix various departments together on teams to force that diverse dynamic to take place. Next bullet, provide organization-wide incentives for change. In that second sentence, perhaps you can tie outcomes to bonuses, raises, or promotions. For example, you can link better performance with diverse groups to coveted assignments. So in other words, if you put people in diverse groups and they perform well, that's their springboard for advancing through the organization, because they've achieved that diversity IQ that you need in all of your leaders, that inclusive leadership element that's going to propel your organization to the next level. One example of this is impact mapping for training. For example, eliminating the check the box element to training so that people don't go back to their jobs right after the training and assume business as usual. You associate it with their performance evaluation, and you tie some element to it, to their merit increase that they get every period. to demonstrate that they're going to demonstrate behaviors that have shown that the training has an impact on how they approach folks in diverse settings. They call it impact mapping. And the next bullet, encourage self-awareness. We all have biases. Again, the first step of the 12-step program. Owning up to and talking about our biases is the first part of the solution. And lastly, don't blame or shame others when bias is acknowledged by them. We need to have safe spaces and safe zones within organizations so that people feel comfortable making mistakes, asking questions, bringing their true self to work, raising problems, even disagreeing, right, with management. It's okay to disagree as long as you come with a better solution. And this is another way of describing a term called psychological safety. And you see in that second sentence, create a safe place for people to acknowledge their own mistakes. One example of a lack of psychological safety to close this session out. NASA Challenger space shuttle, 1986. An engineer named Mr. Ebling knew that the seals would not hold as that rocket propelled through the atmosphere and the temperature changes, and it could not extend extreme heat cool. And those seals would break, threatening the disastrous explosion of that Challenger spacecraft, which actually happened. You know why it wasn't brought up? Because NASA had an environment of psychological danger. In fact, engineers were to be seen and not heard, particularly on Mr. Ebling's level, and 7 astronauts and trillions of dollars worth of technology, even maybe a cure for cancer was on that ship, who knows, went up in smoke because Ebling didn't feel psychologically safe to challenge and bring up this problem when he needed to. Another element to that fact pattern, President Ronald Reagan was making a State of the Union address the next day, and he was going to mention this launch of this Space Shuttle Challenger in his speech. So far be it from them, NASA, to not launch this spacecraft, regardless of whatever was brought up. So again, a poignant example of the lack of psychological safety. So you must ask your question within your organizations. Is there psychological safety? Do people bring their true self to work? Feel comfortable asking questions, raising problems, making mistakes, being themselves, and yes, even disagreeing. And with that, I'll leave you with the conclusion of the workshop. And I'm looking forward to any questions that you might raise that I can answer for you. Thanks a lot for your time and engagement.
All right, so we do have a few questions from the audience. So we got a question about what about Native Americans? Where are they located within the construct of systemic bias? This was a question I had as we were moving through the presentation as well, and thinking about the way that our society looks at all various different types of groups and how that might impact or play out in operations within an organization.
Sure, and thanks for the question. I have a ice-breaking exercise in some of my workshops called Let Me Identify Myself. And just in a workshop I gave last week, a couple of people identified themselves as Native American and Irish American, right? And they self-identified stereotypes that they know to be prevalent about that culture. You know, hey, we all just like to drink a lot because we're Native American, and we all live on reservations, you know. So what I challenge them to do is debunk that stereotype by a fact that we otherwise wouldn't recognize or realize about that culture. And I challenge them to identify themselves by their cultural orientation, not by their race. You know, the census is occurring this year, and they force you to check Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, two or more. But how many of you know that it explains much more about you if you check that you're Polish and Irish American versus just white, or whether you're Black and the daughter of Asian American immigrant and Jamaican American immigrant, and that happens to describe someone who's running for vice president, Kamala Harris. So it's much more instructive to know about her immigrant parents' history than it is for her to just call herself Black, but she prefers to call herself Black. I understand that. We have to default to how people want to identify themselves. And then Native American is certainly in the list of ethnicities that are protected, a protected class. And so you can't discriminate or disparately treat these folks, whether it's in employment, advancement through the organization, unfair job assignments, etc. So they have their firm foot in protective class status. And organizations must be cognizant of that as they shape and form their policies.
Great. And we also have a question that came in that is, what is one thing that folks can do today to start interrogating bias within their workplace? So the take home, when I get back to my job, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to tackle this.
Well, I think that first bullet on the next to last slide, when we talk about examining your organization, ensure transparency, examine decision-making, social networking, policies and procedures to determine where bias may exist. Now, again, this takes a totally objective point of view. When you examine your internal policies, it's not an indictment on the organization, it's to form a baseline from which you must improve, right? So I recommend that you hire an expert to help facilitate this type of exercise, but you need to, well, I'll give you an example. When I was with the City of Columbus, Mayor Ginther, under the leadership of First Lady Shannon Ginther, created the Columbus Women's Commission. And they have several companies signed on to this pledge for pay equity. And so one of the things we encouraged was for each organization to examine their own pay rates, men versus women, to see if there were disparities. Several organizations did that, and without questioning the reason behind the disparity, they instantly equated the pay for all men and women where they found disparities, where they were at the same pay grade or pay level. So that's the kind of affirmative action that needs to be taken, and you need to have real transparency and courage within your organization to take those types of steps for equality. But that's one example, pay equity among gender. You can, I call myself the lead strategist. So in order to explore strategic solutions, you have to have data, you have to have metrics, you have to have dashboards. And so information is power. So you have to have information that you track these key indicators or key performance indicators, KPIs, and you have to act on them after you have the data that's at hand.
So we have another great question. Our audience is really giving us some fantastic questions. We'll try to do our best to get through them all. The next one is, how can we approach increasing diversity? Now, the question says on a board of directors in a meaningful way, but maybe we can even expand this to how do we increase diversity without falling into tokenism?
Yeah, and again, strategic. You can be strategic about it. Whatever your customer base is of your organization, whoever your clients are or your customers, if you aren't reflective of that on your board or within the demographic makeup of your organization, that's a business reason for, it's just like the Teresa Long example when I was chief diversity officer with the city. She said, hey, I need more white guys. So she saw a disparity within her organization that she doesn't have enough white males to further examine health disparities within that population. So it just takes truth telling and data to sort of undress yourself and expose the inequities and have the courage and apply the resources, because this stuff takes money, just like any other frontline operation imperative does, to correct it. So I would just say approach it with objectivity and truth telling.
We have another question. What is the distinction between working on equity and diversity and committing to being an anti-racist organization?
Yes. When I define terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, I do it this way. Diversity means value. Inclusion means success. And equity, so I like to say it this way, and it's in some of my promotional material. Diversity is a fact, inclusion is an act, and equity must be exact. And so if you practice those principles, the element of racism gets taken care of in the process, I think. In other words, as long as people continue to have children that with other folks that don't look like them or from other parts of the world, as long as they keep adopting children that are from around the world that are different from them, there will be diversity. No walls or laws can prevent the inevitability of diversification of our society. Same time, while diversity is a noun, it is a state of being, inclusion is a verb. It takes an affirmative action to include somebody. And so the idea with inclusion is you want to include all diverse perspectives. So if there's a vacuum of diversity within a boardroom, chances are you're not making the best decisions for that organization because you're not looking at it all different ways. And I'll give you an example, this quick example. Back when there was a war on women and Congress had a special subcommittee to study whether women were being treated fairly in healthcare, the subcommittee in Congress was comprised of all white males. So how will you, in competence, treat an issue related to women when you have all men, white men, deliberating the issue on the subcommittee? So that tells you in a loud scream that you need more diversity in Congress that represents the wide diversity of issues that Congress has to face.
Thank you. Now we have several questions about board diversity. I think they are all in the vein of increasing the diversity of a board, whether it be small boards or large boards, and what even small, tiny organizations that might be volunteer led, what can they do to start increasing their diversity?
Again, I think board members, and I deal with a lot of boards in my work, I always like to say this: board members are well intended and well off financially, but not well informed. And so it's a matter of information that we get from diverse perspectives that's needed on board. And I'll give you an example. I used to have a cartoon on my door, and it was a boardroom table full of white middle-aged males. And the chair of the board had this bubble above his head and said, "I don't know why people don't think we have a diverse board. We have board members from Harvard, Yale, Penn, Columbia." So you get the point. They felt that it's okay to have diversity among the Ivy League as long as it was still within the Ivy League. And so that Ivy League perspective doesn't serve that board well when it comes to having the need for diverse perspectives to lead to diverse solutions. There's also a diagram done by Korn Ferry that proves that diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams. And this is true throughout research, although they get out the box slow because they're diverse and they're trying to figure out strengths and weaknesses of each other and get comfortable. Once they do norm, their performance is high above those who are homogenous because they come from the same schools, they think the same way, they approach solutions the same way. So you know the saying, if you've always do what you've always done, you will always be what you've always been. And so I don't think that any organization on this call wants that. You want to be something that you haven't been. You want more market share. You want a bigger competitive advantage. And so the way to diversify your board is to have that political will or chutzpah to find people that are diverse and yet talented. As one of the bullets said, that good fit diagram, it just may happen that the person that can have the solution to your problem is diverse. So don't look for that sameness. Look for culture add, not culture fit.
It sounds a lot like you're saying that, we tend to go towards fit because it's comfortable. And some of the work of diversifying a board is getting a little bit uncomfortable with going out to pursue those relationships with people that you wouldn't otherwise typically do. We have one question, which I do not expect you to read a bibliography here for us today, but I do want you to ask you. It says, what research supports the theory of implicit bias? And so I wanted to say that, could we work together, you and I, off of camera, and just maybe put a short list together of things that a person might be able to read that would help them come into some understanding about this. And we will send that out with your documents. So your question will be addressed, but not during this forum.
Yeah, Daniel, I can just say one thing. Google is a powerful tool. Just please Google implicit bias and its origins, or schemas, SCHMEAS, schemas. That will tell you all you need to know about how implicit bias originated, how it's, mental, how we all have it, how it's ingrained in us through decades, centuries of exposure to ideas, concepts that are oftentimes fallacy.
Okay. So I think that's all the questions we have time for. We have some really excellent ones left over around psychological safety and how to assess that in an organization. And hopefully we can get some of these questions answered for you in a document that we can send out in an email after this is over. Thank you so much for taking your time out today to chat with us. This was full of wonderful information, and the Q&A really helped, I think, folks make this actionable. Please be on the lookout for the slides. Those will be a really good resource for you when you start your journey on trying to improve the diversity of your organization. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much. All right, take care,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.